And the portion of God's Word that we will look at specifically this morning is from the Gospel of Mark. I invite you to turn there with me, Mark chapter 7. And we look this morning at verses 24 to 30. Mark chapter 7, verses 24 to 30. So why don't we look together at these verses just now. I'll read them for you. And then we'll look at this next incident, according to Mark, that took place in the ministry of Christ when he was living among us here on earth. Mark chapter 7, verse 24. From there, Jesus arose and went away to the region of Tyre. And when he had entered a house, he wanted no one to know of it, yet he could not escape notice. But after hearing of him, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately came and fell at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of the Syrophoenician race. And she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter, and he was saying to her, "Let the children be satisfied first, for it's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But she answered and said to him, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table feed on the children's crumbs." And he said to her, "Because of this answer, go your way. The demon has gone out of your daughter." And going back to her home, she found the child lying on the bed, the demon having departed. This is the next section of God's Word that we look at together. Here's the deal. The Lord had been ministering to multitudes for a long, long time. And whether he felt the need for a rest, or he felt the disciples' need for a rest, or some combination of both, or some other reason, we're not sure exactly, he decided to leave the crowds. And so he went far north to the part of the world which was then called Phoenicia, to a town called Tyre, which is now a city called Sur in the country of Lebanon, way up on the Mediterranean coast. And it was a specific intention up there in Tyre to get away from it all, to get away from people. So he found a house, one way or the other. He found a house and went into it, and he just tried to lay low there. But it didn't happen. People heard that he was there. His reputation had preceded him, and so he was surrounded, as always, by a whole lot of needy people. And our attention is focused this morning on one particular needy person, a woman, a native to that area who lived in Tyre or some community nearby perhaps, a woman with a desperate problem. And it was a desperate problem as a mother would count a problem, for it was a problem with her daughter. And strangely, the daughter's problem was that she was cruelly tormented by a demon. That's what Matthew says in the parallel account. A woman's daughter was cruelly tormented by this angelic creature, by this non-human evil spirit. This happened a lot in the days of Jesus. We have reason to believe it continues to happen in these days. But the woman saw it happening to her daughter in whatever way it was happening. And she heard that Jesus was in town, and she sought him out, and she asked him to rid her daughter of this horrible problem. And as we look at what happened next, we have opportunity to answer a question which is of real importance to each of us. And the question, as you see it printed on the sermon outline on the back of your bulletin, is this: what do we need to get help from Jesus Christ? What do we need? What are the requirements if we are going to see Jesus help us with our problems? You may have a problem of the same sort of dimension as this woman had. Perhaps a terrible problem. Perhaps something terrible going on with someone you love, as this woman did with her daughter. Or perhaps it's something going on in your life. Or perhaps you don't have a problem in the world. In which case you'll observe the fact that people who don't have problems sometimes later on do. And you'll want to take all of this down as reference point for later. What do we need in order to get help from Jesus Christ? Some of the conditions can be categorized. We could start by saying, is there a geographic requirement? That is, does geography matter? Do you need to be in one particular place at the right time in order to get help from Jesus Christ? It looks as if the answer is yes, but if you're taking notes and filling in blanks, don't do it that way, because that would be wrong. It's not yes, it's no, but it looks like yes, because the whole thing happened because this woman heard that Jesus was in her town, and so she went to the place that he was. And she specifically entreated him. She made her appeal to him in person. So it looks for all the world like geography matters. Like you need to be where Jesus is if you want him to help you. But of course that's a wrong answer, as illustrated from the story, because the woman wasn't the one with the problem, except in the sense that her daughter was being cruelly tormented. The daughter was the one with the problem. The daughter was the one who had this unhealthy association with this supernatural being. And she was at some distance. She didn't go to the house. The woman did. The woman did on her behalf. So the very fact that the little child is delivered of the demon, though she was nowhere near Jesus, is an illustration of what perhaps we all knew already anyway. There are no geographic requirements to getting help from Jesus Christ. You can apply for help from Jesus anywhere in this world of his, and he will hear you, whether you are here or there or wherever, whether you seem far away from everything or close to everything. Doesn't matter. You're close to him. He's close to you, and geography doesn't matter. Well, that's perhaps a statement of the obvious, but it whets our appetite and prepares us for the next category. What do we need to get help from Jesus Christ? Are there ethnic requirements? Now, most of us growing up in this part of the world in this generation would know this is a no. This has got to be a no, right? And it is. But the people in those days didn't know it was a no. In fact, they were sure it was a yes. In fact, if Jesus had a little pop quiz at the time, his disciples would be sure to flunk it, because they were ingrained with the idea that their proximity to God through Jesus Christ and their good standing with Jesus Christ had everything to do with the fact that they were card-carrying members of the Jewish nation. They were covenant people. They were in this relationship with God which was more or less exactly specific to the Jewish race. It seemed to them blatantly clear that there was a very strict ethnic requirement, and that if you wanted Jesus, the son of David, to have anything to do with you needed to be a Jew. That's what they knew was right, and they were wrong. It wasn't right. And this story is here in part to show us, maybe I say primarily to show us, that in fact wasn't true. We saw last week in passing that Jesus pronounced all foods clean. And so the dietary restrictions of the Old Testament were disbanded through the ministry of Christ. Well, this is like it, only far more important, as any kind of ethnic restrictions are disbanded. Such as they were, they are dispelled with Jesus, and the story proves it. Now, this is the very point upon which the story turns, and we read in verse 26 that this woman was in fact a Gentile. Mark actually says she was a Greek, but that's the Jewish mindset. There was us and there's them. There's Jewish people, there's the good guys, and there's all those Greek-speaking people. That's everybody else. So when he says Greek, it's appropriately translated Gentile because it means non-Jewish. And she was a particular sort of non-Jewish person. She was a Syrophoenician, which is interesting for us to note because it means that she was really a native to the area. Matthew, in fact, calls her a Canaanite. You know, the Promised Land used to be called the land of Canaan because it was full of Canaanites. They were the horrible idolaters. They were the terrible people that Joshua exterminated in the name of the Lord back when he fought the Battle of Jericho and did all that other Old Testament stuff. Well, she was a descendant of one of those original people who were evicted from the land so that Israel could take over the land many hundreds of years before. She was a bona fide pagan. That's the point of this description. And yet she dared to come to the Lord. And although the Lord treated her in a way which may raise some questions in our minds, questions about good manners and decency and play and so on, he didn't send her away. In fact, we get that from the parallel account in Matthew, for we're told in Matthew that the disciples persistently asked Jesus to send her away, and it's worth noting that he never did. So she was allowed to speak to him, though the disciples found it quite inappropriate and quite a nuisance. And the very fact that her prayers were answered in due time shows us what Mark wants us to see, that the Lord did not come to any particular race, period, but he came to the whole world, to people of all races, and that should be good news to us, because most of us are from a different race than the original tribe of the original nation of Israel. If there is an ethnic requirement, most of us would certainly flunk it, so this is good news to us. But anyway, geographic requirement, that's a no. Everybody knows that. Ethnic requirement, that's a no. The Jews didn't know it, but we do. How about spiritual requirements? Well, we're all set to say no and make it a perfect 3. That would be wrong. Is there a spiritual requirement? The answer is yes. And of course, the spiritual requirement, there's room on the line to write it as well as the word yes. The spiritual requirement is faith. And this is a story about a person from a different race who had great and significant faith. We see this in the words that are exchanged between Jesus and the lady. He says to her in verse 27, "Let the children be satisfied first, for it's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." And she answered and said, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table feed on the children's crumbs." And we would say on first read, whatever's going on there, she answered well, as verse 29 shows. For the Lord said to her, verse 29, "Because of this answer, go your way, the demon has gone out of your daughter." That is to say, because of this answer, go your way, you get what you want. You get the help that you need. Your daughter is cured of this horrible spiritual problem. And Matthew helps us as well as we read the account in Matthew. For Matthew shows us in the very same phrase that the Lord also said to her, "Your faith is great." So that was what was good about the answer. Your answer is good, your faith is great. So she had the one thing she needed. She had faith. And that's a helpful thing for us to recognize. And perhaps that's a statement of the obvious as well, but I'd like you to land upon it today and think about it. There's a spiritual requirement. You may be in great need. You may not be, but someday you will be in great need. It may occur to you that the greatest help you could have with your need is the help from Jesus Christ himself, for he's a human being. He understands what it's like to be human, but he sits at the right hand of God, as equal to God. He has all the power of the universe at his disposal. He has all the power himself, and he knows what it's like to be human. He'd be the perfect one to have on your side, right? So if you need his help, you need to meet the requirements, and the requirement is faith. This story is about that. And this story gives us details about that faith, which helps us to understand the nature of the faith that we must have as a spiritual requirement if we wish Jesus Christ to help us with any of our problems. So we can look for three answers to the question, what must faith be like exactly? And as we look at the woman, we get some answers. What must faith be like exactly? Well, for starters, it must be, as the woman's was, persistent. It must be persistent. We see this in verse 26, where after telling us that she's a Gentile and from Syrophoenicia, it tells us that she kept asking Jesus. She kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. This was no whimsy of an idea. She didn't come and pop the request once and back off and wait to see what happens. She didn't ask once, change her mind, and go back to the previous plan or lack of plan. She asked, and then she asked again. And then she asked again. And then she kept asking. And it says in Matthew, as the disciples are appealing to Jesus to send her away, that what was irritating them was that she kept shouting. So she wasn't particularly close. That's the geographic thing again. She wasn't standing right beside him and continuing to tug at his garment. She was at some distance. She might have been in the window or in the doorway of the house. He was perhaps, off in the next room. And she shouted at him, and she kept at it, and she showed persistence. And this, of course, is a good thing. Faith should be persistent. Faith should continue. Our faith needs to endure in order for it to do us any good, and we must note that. So, what that means is that if you've been told that all you need to do to get help from Jesus is just simply ask, and that's it, you may have been misinformed. It's not enough to simply ask, in the sense of it's not enough to simply have a little bit of faith, a bit, for a while. You have to have a faith that persists. You have to have a faith that keeps you in a position of faith for a long time. Faith that is good. Faith is persistent faith. And as we're tracking down a description of this faith, someone might want to point out that that's not exactly a definition. That is to say, the faith should be persistent is simply to say that whatever it is, it needs to last. And that's true. So we need to look at more details to see what it is that needs to last. What is it which you need to persist in order to continue to receive help from Jesus Christ? So we look for more details, and we get them. In fact, as we come to the second answer to the question, we get the most notable thing about this woman, the thing that Jesus remarked on specifically. So what do we see next? We see humility. We see that in addition to being persistent, faith must be humble. This was certainly the most remarkable thing about her. We get a clue of that, or a first indication of that, in verse 25. For this woman, it says, whose little daughter had an unclean spirit, immediately came and she fell at his feet. She fell at his feet. There's humility in that, isn't there? I mean, you can't maintain some sense of dignity and self-worth while groveling on the ground in front of somebody, while clutching at someone's feet. She did make it to him, you see, so she fell at his feet, although Matthew tells us that it was her shouting that was getting on their nerves. So perhaps the crowd jostled her away after a while, and she stood at a distance eventually. Maybe the disciples caused that to happen. But at any rate, at one point, she got close enough to him, and she didn't simply tap him on the shoulder, she didn't simply shake his hand, or anything else that would suggest the meeting of equals. She didn't confide in him and say, this is something that might interest you, I lay it before you for your discretionary thought. But rather, in an act of terrific humility, she threw herself down at his feet. There's the humility. But the humility comes out even more clearly when we get to the dialogue between her and Jesus. For Jesus says words which might sound wrong, or perhaps just at least rude to us, when he finally talks to her in verse 27. He says in regard to her request, verse 27, "Let the children be satisfied first, for it's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." And anyone who understood the language as he was speaking it would be sure to catch on the fact that he's not speaking in flattering terms to her. He's not saying, oh, let the children go first because you're far more important. He's comparing his own people to the children and comparing her to something inferior to the children. And it sounds actually pretty insulting. And it is, in a way, undoubtedly insulting, but I can soften the whole thing a bit if you're squirming here at the thought of Jesus so full of compassion and love, speaking so insultingly. Here's the deal. In the actual Greek, which Mark is writing in here, the word dog is in a sort of unique form. It's got a little thing at the end. It's called a diminutive suffix. That's a little thing you put at the end to make to soften the word. And we haven't really got any way of doing it with any kind of class here. If we tried to translate it in the sense that he spoke it, we'd have to say, it's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the doggies. And that's not all that helpful because who knows what that means. But there's no doubt in the Greek language. It means the cute little dog. It means the dog that you let in your house. See, in those days, the Jews had this ethnic pride. They felt that they were people and everyone else was dogs. And they referred to Gentiles as dogs, and they did not mean anything happy or nice at all. They were thinking about those filthy, flea-bitten scavengers that lurked around the streets and the alleyways, especially at night, made it dangerous to be out at night. They're thinking of the dogs that ate Queen Jezebel after she had died and left nothing but her hands and her feet. I mean, they're thinking about these horrible, dangerous, gnarly, flea-bitten scavengers. And Jesus did not use a word that would bring up that image at all. So we need to retranslate it in our minds. He didn't say, not good to take it to the children, throw it to the dogs. He wasn't saying that at all. He was saying, not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the puppy dogs. Throw it to the cute little puppies. Okay, that's the sense in which he's talking. There's no way off the hook entirely. He's speaking of her in demeaning terms. He's referring to her as something less than human or something less than children in this. But it's not quite as scathing and derogatory a term as you might think if you didn't have the background on it. Besides that, he didn't say, go away, dog, or even go away, cute little puppy. He said it's not good to give the bread. He said the bread's got to go to the children first. And in that word first, there's the clear indication that there's supper coming for the puppy afterwards. But she's got to wait in line. And the point you see is that the news of salvation through Jesus Christ and all that God did come to the Jews first. They were first in line. Paul the Apostle says the same thing. The gospel is the power of God to the Jew first and also to the Greek. To the Jew first and then the rest of the world. So she had to get in line. And in order to point that out, he makes this analogy, which is insulting, though not horribly insulting. He says, like a little puppy dog, get behind until the children eat first. And her wonderful response shows that she was not only able to handle the insult, but she actually embraced it in a sense. That is, she was not only able to handle the non-flattering terms in which he described her, but she admitted to them. She agreed. And so she let it stand. And she said in verse 28, yes, which is to say, I accept the analogy. The Jews are your children, and they get first dibs on the bread. And I'm just like a little puppy dog skulking around the back of the table hoping someone will slip him a crumb. But, she says, that's what happens to puppy dogs. They get slipped little crumbs. If the children are eating, there's crumbs left over for the dogs. There's also Brussels sprouts and a whole lot of other stuff that the children sort of slough away, right? So she says, I can work with this. I can accept this. Sure, I'm just a little puppy dog. I hardly belong here. But surely there's some crumbs for me. And her answer he responds to her answer in such a way that we can see that these strange words of his in verse 27 were very clearly a test of faith, very clearly an opportunity for her to prove her faith. And what she proves about her faith is that faith, true faith that persists, is humble. So it would be a contradiction in terms of huge order to speak about a person who's proud and full of faith, because real faith is humble. And that's not all it is. Real faith is obedient. Persistent and humble and obedient. If your faith is real, it's persistent and humble and obedient. And we see the obedience at the end of the story. For she who was shouting out her request and wouldn't stop her request and was continuing to ask, suddenly stopped asking when Jesus said, go your way. He said in verse 29, go your way. And in verse 30, it says she went back to her home. So she immediately left. And the disciples would have said, so she finally stopped shouting. What did you say to her? Jesus' answer, I simply told her to go. And she went. As soon as I told her to go, she went. Her faith was obedient. Now, we've seen already that there's an element of obedience in true faith. In fact, I've often described faith to you as trusting God enough to obey Him. The definition stands, and she illustrates it. But in addition to that, we can say that true faith is having the humility to trust Him enough to obey Him, or being humble enough to obey the Lord. And I'm sure you'll agree with me as you consider obeying anyone that there's humility involved in taking orders from someone. This is a humility that's absolutely necessary to the spirit of true faith. Absolutely necessary. If you have a sort of faith that is not humble, if you have a sort of obedience that's mixed up with pride, then it's not the sort of faith that will do you any lasting good. And as proof of that, we only need to look at another detail of the story, and the detail has to do with what perhaps is particularly appropriate for us as a church family to look at this morning, on the morning of October 31st. And tonight, as the whole community around us goes into this weird mode where they celebrate graveyards and death and guillotines and all sorts of horrible things and play around with the occult as if it's a funny thing and speak about Devil's Night and play with black magic and pretend to be demons and so on, it's good for us to look at the story and see a real live explanation of a true interaction between a particular human being and a demon or some demons. And we can ask ourselves the question, what do we need to know about these evil angelic beings, these evil non-human spirit creatures who sometimes cruelly torment people? And what we see will help us with our basic investigation today as we continue to look at the nature of good faith. What do we need to know about demons? Well, from the story, what we need to know in the first place is that they acknowledge Jesus Christ. They acknowledge Jesus Christ. They don't have any arguments about His identity. They know and recognize and freely and publicly acknowledge that He is the Son of God. We see this in the Gospel of Mark. We see it in James as well. That's a typo, by the way. It should be James 2:19. That's where it says that we do well to believe, but after all, the demons also believe, and they tremble. The demons believe. They believe in the sense that they acknowledge Jesus Christ. And we saw that in Mark chapter 1, where Jesus encountered a man with a demon who was in a synagogue. And the demonized man in Mark 1:24 said, "What do we have to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." And there's the demon speaking out of this poor, tormented soul in the synagogue. The demon says, "You are the Holy One of God." So demons acknowledge Christ. And so they do by the legion, by the hundreds and hundreds in Mark chapter 5, where Jesus comes across another poor tormented soul who's running around like a crazy person in a graveyard. And the demon within him, actually many demons, speak in Mark chapter 5, verse 7, crying out with a loud voice. He says, "What do I have to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you by God, do not torment me." These demons acknowledge Jesus Christ. Note that, and let's move on. Besides that, they obey Jesus Christ. When Jesus is dealing with the man in the synagogue and the demon screams out, "I know who you are, the Holy One of God," Mark 1:25 shows us Jesus rebuking the demon. He says, "Be quiet and come out of him." And the demon obeys immediately. With the man running around in the graveyard, the same thing. He calls Jesus the Son of the Most High God, and Jesus says to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And then he asks him the question, and the demon answers the question. The demon lives in obedience to Jesus Christ. That's interesting. Demons, these angelic creatures, these devil's agents working in the world to torment people as they have opportunity, acknowledge Jesus Christ, and they obey Him. Although we would want to say that their obedience is a sort of skeptical or questionable sort of obedience. But take it down for now and think about it. We're wondering about the nature of real faith, the kind of faith that meets the spiritual requirements to receive help from Christ. We're seeing it's faith that must persist. We're seeing it's faith that must be humble. We're seeing faith that must be obedient. And the demons show us that it's not enough to simply acknowledge Jesus Christ, and it's not enough to just obey Him. So if you are somewhere in your relationship to God through Jesus Christ, you have opportunity here to examine where you are and assess what you got and see if you are in any better state than those demons who certainly will be sent into the lake of fire after the judgment day. You may, in fact, acknowledge Jesus Christ. If someone were to ask you about your relationship to to the God of the Bible or to the God that's worshipped at West London Alliance Church, you might say with some gladness of heart, well, I certainly acknowledge Jesus Christ to be the Lord. And that's good, but it's not much good. The demons do that, and it doesn't do them any good at all, except to help them know their enemy. And you might say, well, coming to understand something about the Bible, I've begun to conform my life to its standards. I'm pretty obedient. And you have to say, well, okay, that's better than being disobedient, but it doesn't mean that your relationship with God is good and sound. The demons also obey, though they do so reluctantly. Someone will say, well, hold on, if the demons acknowledge Christ and they obey Him, then what's wrong with the demons? And the answer comes as we consider the story more fully and the rest of the scriptures on the subject. As a third thing to note about demons, we can say they do not humble themselves. They obey, but they don't obey humbly. They do not humble themselves. Luke chapter 11 is an important cross-reference. It talks about how when demons are sent away, as they were when the Lord spoke to them and they obeyed, they skulk around in waterless places for a while, but take opportunity, if they're given it, to come back, and they bring 7 of their friends with them. So being delivered of a demon doesn't necessarily in itself free you from future problems, because demons will come back. If they're sent away, they will seek to come back. Their obedience is reluctant. And that contrasts the kind of obedience the Lord wants from us. The kind of obedience that Paul speaks about in Romans 6 when he says to the Romans, you were slaves of sin, but you've become obedient from the heart to that form of teaching to which you've been committed. The kind of obedience that means something to God is the kind of obedience that comes from the heart. And that's the kind of obedience that comes from humility. That's the kind of obedience that comes from laying yourself down before God. So the demons obey because they have to. And they acknowledge Jesus Christ because they can't get around it. They know who He is. But they're not in any kind of right relationship to God, and they're not going to receive any help from Jesus Christ, and He doesn't offer them salvation. So with people who also acknowledge Jesus Christ and are inclined to obey Him, but don't humble their hearts, don't acknowledge Him and trust Him not only enough to obey Him, but trust Him enough to humble themselves and are humble enough to trust Him and obey Him. We could wrap all those words together. Now, Bible scholars will tell us that the Gospel of Mark is actually written from Peter's perspective, because Mark wasn't an eyewitness of the events, but Peter was, and it's a matter of record that Mark accompanied Peter and later in life, and so people understand the Gospel of Mark to really be from Peter's perspective. And that's a good excuse for us to turn to our final reference of the morning, 1 Peter chapter 5. And let's go to the source, so to speak, of Mark's Gospel. Let's go to the Apostle Peter. He was there in the city of Tyre and in the house when this woman spoke her faith and received her request. And he has these words to say to us on the subject of being humble before God. Now, interestingly, and draw your own conclusions, on the subject of humility, he thinks of the young men in the congregation, and he speaks to them first, so I will as well. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 5, on the subject of humility, singles out the younger men for this distinct instruction. It says, you younger men, likewise, be subject to your elders. And there it is, the young men are specifically called to be in submission to those who are older than them. And then Peter makes it general and says, and all of you, so now we're all on the hook, all of you, clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. And why should we? Because God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So clothe yourselves with humility. And I hope you see how this fits with what we've looked at already. It'd be one thing to simply acknowledge Jesus Christ. Well, yeah, He's the Lord, I can't deny it. He's who He said He is. Fine. But there's a pride. There could be a pride to that, which leaves you in a position where God is resisting you. And you can be obedient. You can say, well, yeah, the way of the Bible is the way of truth and life, and yeah, there's no future in disobedience, so I'll obey. And yet you can still be proud in your heart. And God will resist you. He resists the proud. He pushes the proud away from Him. Think about how horrible that is. And then you get into your time of need, and you call out to Jesus Christ, but you're a proud person, and He pushes you away. He doesn't welcome you with open arms. He pushes you away because you're proud. This is what Peter is alarmed about. He says, clothe yourself with humility, for God resists the proud and gives grace to the humble. Then he says it again, humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that He may exalt you at the proper time, casting all your anxiety upon Him because He cares for you. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God. Now, we as a congregation are endeavoring to be a group of people who are absolutely thrilled about and motivated by the greatness of God. So our theme is, our motto as a church is making known the greatness of God. And the greatness of God is the incentive or the vocation of the humility. Peter says, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God. So I feel obligated to say to us as we take on and warm up to this idea of making known God's greatness, if we are going to specialize in any sense as a church, if we are going to focus upon the greatness of God, then it's absolutely essential for the integrity of this church that we be noted for our humility. If we are going to be especially hyped up about the greatness of God, we need to be notably humble. And if we're going to talk about comparisons and so on, I mean, a church can focus on any number of things. If we're going to focus on the greatness of God, we've got to be noted for our great humility. Because it's the greatness of God that causes people to be humble. See, up until now, in this part, in the world, I mean, up until the New Testament was written, humility was always an insult. You never flattered a person by saying humble. Humble meant mealy-mouthed and wimpy and weak and irritating and despicable, and humble was bad. Then all of a sudden, these terrific people, these apostles that people held in such high esteem, talked about being humble as a good thing. And here's Peter as an example. Said, now, everybody humble themselves. Everybody be humble. And it was a mind-boggling element. There's lots in the New Testament. This is one of the most notable mind-boggling elements. Suddenly humility was a good thing. But you see, it comes with a proper relationship with God. It comes with understanding that God is great. And when you see He's great, of course you humble yourself under Him. You're not going to swagger in the presence of an infinite God. If you can swagger into God's presence, you must not know very much about God at all. So if we're going to be people who know about the greatness of God and make His greatness known, we need to be people unusually humble. This is what He calls us to do. And any place in the Scriptures that I can think of where we are told to submit to authorities, whether it's God's authority or anyone else's authority, the subject of fear is always addressed. So Peter says, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God and cast all your anxieties upon Him. So if the whole idea of submitting to Him makes you anxious, if you're anxious about submitting to Him, why would that be? Because if you submit to Him, you're going to have to obey Him. Maybe you don't want to obey Him. Maybe you're nervous about obeying Him. He says, cast all your anxieties upon Him, for He cares for you. King James, cast your cares upon Him, for He cares for you. There's a play on word there that helps us remember it. Now, having said all of that, having called us to be humble before the Lord, to be low before the Lord, not to swagger into His presence and say, hey, good news, God, you got me. But rather to come humbly before God and say, mercy upon me, Lord, a sinner who doesn't belong here. Like the lady who said, okay, call me a dog, I'm a dog. But I call, as a dog, I call for a crumb. I mean, with that kind of humility, then Peter says, verse 8, be of sober spirit, be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls about like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. There's the devil, and there are demons who work for him. And Peter says on that subject, be on the alert, be of sober spirit. Verse 9, resist him. And the point is, you see, that resisting the devil and staying firm in your faith is vitally connected to being humble before God. Why is that? Because the proud, the non-humble, God resists. And when God pushes you away, guess who He's pushing you towards? As God pushes you away, He pushes you out into the big bad world where the devil prowls about. You want to be safe from the roaring lion? Then you've got to get away from the roaring lion. How do you do that? By getting near to God. How do you get near to God? By humbling yourself. So this idea of humility is vitally connected to this idea of being strong against demons, being free from any kind of evil power. And the Bible never says that we should be afraid of the devil or demons, but we need to be alert about them, and we need to resist them. And our resistance comes from refusing to get far from God, insisting on staying close to God. And we stay close to God by being humble before Him. Incidentally, James says the very same thing. He says, draw near to God, and He will draw near to you. Resist the devil. And it's the very same thing. You resist the devil by getting close to God. Faith is trusting God enough to obey Him. You can't do that without humility. So faith is being humble enough to trust Him enough to obey Him. And it is the absolute non-negotiable spiritual requirement. In whatever condition you find yourself in right now, however you would describe your life, you disqualify yourself. Listen, you disqualify yourself from help from Jesus Christ if you will not humble yourself. Be humble enough to trust yourself enough, to trust Him enough to obey Him. This woman, who was in the minds of the disciples a real nobody, received an answer to prayer of the first order. She got exactly what she wanted in prayer because her faith was great, because her answer was good. That is, because she humbled herself. And we have reason to believe that some of our most difficult problems, some of our greatest burdens can be resolved, and our prayers can be answered as we follow her example. Okay, so let's think of ourselves as dogs. Let's think of ourselves as insignificant people who don't really belong in the presence of the Lord. But then as puppy dogs, let's beg. Let's humble ourselves before the Lord. Let's not stand off and wait to see him prove himself, and then we'll condescend to follow him a while. But let's humble ourselves before God and come into his presence and appeal to him for mercy and ask him to do for us that favor that we need and to give us that help that we need. The Bible says God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. And as our faith causes us to be humble, as our faith is a humble sort of faith, we can look forward to answers to prayer unlike answers we've seen before. For God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And we need not fear the reality behind all the nonsense of a Halloween night. There's a reality to it which we ought to be alert about. But we need not fear any of it. For our God is a great God. And as we humble ourselves under his mighty hand, we will be saved from every evil and harm. And our prayers will be answered as God works in our lives according to his good and acceptable and perfect will.